Alright, here we are. Welcome to the Climate Justice Teach-In. I'm just going to actually read instead of ad-lib because, as we noticed, I don't do no free. So, I'm the moderator today, Calihoo, PhD student here, looking at climate resilient, community resiliency climate in the northern context, provincial. And actually, this name's on my committee, my sister. So, I would like first to do a shout out. We are meeting here on the unceded traditional territories of the Lake Kootenay Nation. Heart and hand, I give thanks. Washrooms are right outside the door there, darn handy. Muster area, if we hear the alarm, I'm a emergency preparedness volunteers. This always comes to mind. I took a look. I'm saying we go out this door together, stay calm, stay together. We go out this door, straight through, out into the open area, and then we'll do more. Awesome. Okay. All right. So, what is climate and justice teaching? What am I telling you? The students of the NBS 480 Senior Capstone course have organized this 3-day climate and justice teach-in from March 23rd to 25th. Heart and hand, I give thanks. Awesome. I mean, what an endeavor. You're full-time students and you take this on to organize, to bring education to us. I love it. As part of the American College Worldwide Initiative, institutions around the world, there's an echo going on right now. We'll be hosting teach-ins throughout the end of March with the aim of engaging campuses and communities in the critical dialogue on climate solutions and justice. As we are part of the Canada's Green University, we feel that it's important that our whole campus participates in these discussions and bring forward the work that our faculty, staff, students, and community are doing on these issues. So we're zooming it as well. And I do believe this is being recorded and will be available following. Awesome. So the impact just continues. All right. Sure. Okay. So how this is going to work is the panels, our panel members, are each going to present for about 7 minutes. So have your questions, your thoughts, your queries ready following, and we're going to open up to dialogue. I will draw upon you. As the moderator, I think that is my privilege. So I may have questions for you. Awesome, okay. So we have today on our panel, Lara Beckett on the end of the table, Director, Regional District of Fraser Fort George. Thank you for what you do, sister. Government is us. Then we have Dr. Rylan, Assistant Professor in the School of Planning and Sustainability.
Sustainability.
Awesome! Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay, and then right next to Rylan is Tannis Reynolds, Professor in the First Nation Studies Department. Then we have Ramla, Dr. Ramla. Qureshi, yeah. The Assistant Professor, School of Engineering, a PhD in Civil Engineering from the University of Buffalo. So what I thought we would do, welcome all, thank you very much for taking the time. What I thought we would do is we'd start with Lara, and then we're going to do popcorn, so whoever wants to go next, awesome. And the panelists will just give a little bit of context about themselves instead of me reading the file. And then they're going to launch right into it. So I will be, and I like, okay, awesome. So now I'm going to go walk here, so to speak. And I will be tracking you, which is cool, right? But at the same time, you have to go, that's awesome. Okay. So without further ado, Lara, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. As Christine said, my name is Lara Beckett, and I am a director with the Regional District of Fraser Fort George. For those of you who don't know what that might be, it's local government for rural areas. So I'm like a city councillor, but for a rural region. The area I represent is kind of from the western boundary of Prince George, Beaverly, going about halfway to Vanderhoof, Myworth, Westlake, Blackwater area. So all the people, ranchers, and Lake communities little bit of my background, going back to my university days, I was in biology and environmental studies at UNBC. And coming out of that, I joined an organization called the Ecoforestry Institute, which was doing community level forestry, really focusing on what to leave first, and then what might be able to be taken out of the forest, and then how you get the most valuable. And so I ran that for a few years, and then I started something called Forest Stewardship Council in British Columbia. So if you ever look at paper, you get the little tree check mark. That's a certification to say this paper came from a sustainably managed forest. So I was involved in establishing the standards of what that good quality forestry was supposed to look like. Years ago, it's really interesting to see where it's come globally since that time. And then I have been elected now for 4 terms, just on about 14 years. So it's been really interesting. I have been kind of pushing the environmental envelope at the regional district and over those years. It's just actually kind of panel. It's like just really glad to be here.
One, amazing background, sister. I forgot my question again. So the panel, I'm just getting interrupted just briefly there, sorry. The question that's being, I just get it right. So the 2 questions that the panel will be addressing are, how can Prince George support a growing community while preparing for future climate impacts in the north? And what role, if any, do you see the university playing in the future of a sustainable Prince George? Back to you, Lara. Thank you very much, sister.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure I'm going to actually ask the question, but we'll get to that later. All right, so the big topics for any city when it comes to climate crisis, there's sort of development, design, density, there's transportation, there's buildings, new and existing is probably the bigger issue from an energy use point of view, and then waste. And so I'll touch on a few of these, don't have piles of time, but we can get into the discussion more later. So how a city grows physically is really important. We can design for mixed residential commercial areas so that people can use transit, they can walk, they can bike, or we can continue to sprawl. You know, Prince George has a huge municipal boundary, it's sort of a semi-rural, large semi-rural area. This means extraordinary expense from a service provision, keeping the roads in good shape. It's enormously expensive. So density is huge. You know, if we sprawl, we just take up more natural areas. We have more effect on the water table and that kind of thing. There's more personal vehicle use. There's less ability to provide transit. You know, so all of these topics are kind of interwoven. An example that I've just come across recently is that New Zealand has banned single-family dwellings within their municipal boundaries. So that means they're focusing on density. And yeah, I think that's something we all have to start taking very seriously. There's things we can do to make cities more appealing for active transportation. So it's ideas like we clean the sidewalks, the bus stops, and the bike lanes of snow first. Routes leading to schools, social services, community business centers, healthcare services, because not only does that allow more active transportation, but it addresses the equity issue. You know, people that don't have personal vehicles, parents with strollers, children going to school, elderly that can't drive. So, I mean, if we just changed the way we cleared our streets, that would help address some of these issues. We can improve transit with a mix of fixed route and on-demand systems. And so I'm learning about these on-demand systems that are starting to work for smaller rural communities. If we make our streets safe, pleasant places for humans to be in, I mean, these are public spaces. They're probably the biggest public spaces in our municipalities is the streets, if you add up the square footage. And they're not very pleasant for people to be in. So if we start, you know, including green spaces, it starts cooling the streets. It absorbs water and runoff and those kind of things. It all addresses things like health and walking and greenhouse gas emissions, sustainability. Context I know best is regional district local government, and this is a little bit different than municipalities. So some of the flexibility that municipalities have, we don't have as regional districts. So we're a little bit more limited, but in the services we offer, there is a lot we can do. In our regional district, we have made secondary suites just allowed across the regional district. We have done a lot of energy retrofitting on the public buildings we own, and there's certainly more to be done. We've done an enormous amount of work on emergency preparedness and trying to educate people around fire smoking and just what you need to do personally to be prepared for emergencies. We've been early adopters of the STEP code, which is around energy efficiency for new buildings. That's going to be coming in place next year, but we've adopted it already, and we're starting to work with the building community to bring those ideas into their work. In the area of solid waste, this is what regional districts, one of the big areas regional districts are involved with. We've started introducing bans and fines on materials that can be reused, repurposed, and diverted into circular economy options. For example, cardboard, clean wood, garden waste, asphalt shingles. We also have a landfill gas capture system. Up until the last few years, we've been flaring that off. So improving things a little bit from methane, to burning it off and flaring it. Not a great option, but we are now starting to work on looking for partners for beneficial use so that we can use that for whether it's going to end up being heating in some way or potentially working with Fortis to try and link it into their system. So this is only a start, and there's a lot more that can be done. But I think the biggest thing around waste that we have to think about is we've got to stop producing it in the first place. We are so wasteful in this society. And that's where personal choice and behavior comes into that. We have to ask ourselves, how much do you really need? How much is enough? And what truly makes life better once the basic needs are met? There's a certain threshold, and we're not meeting it for a lot of society. But beyond that point, how much do you need? Up where I live, people are building 3,500 square foot homes. The average family is 2 parents and 1.2 kids. I don't know how much space you actually need, but that seems excessive to me. These are the kind of things and choices we have to start thinking about as a society. And if we start asking these questions, we can start pushing social change. We can start pushing policy change. And this is where we can address the second question, where institutions like UNBC can start making a difference. And I was thinking about, some of the big areas of study up here: healthcare, engineering, natural resources, economics and business. So much can be done in the curriculum so that students like yourselves can graduate with the ability to push policy and actually bring into practice some of these ideas much faster and much further. And we really need to do things much faster and much further. With the IPCC report that just came out recently, truly we have 7 years to address greenhouse gases, 7 years to truly make a significant difference. And I don't see that happening in time yet. So, there's a few things UNBC is known for, such as the Wood Innovation Design Center, the bioenergy facility. We've got some EV charging stations. These are kind of visible and important steps, but I think so much more can be done within the curriculum itself. And these are questions that, I don't necessarily know, and maybe they're being addressed, but does the medical program actually embed preventative healthcare as the core teaching with everything else coming out of it? Is donut economics, sustainable development goals, and genuine progress indicators being taught instead of GDP? GDP is a terrible measure of economic good, absolutely terrible. If you take things like Lytton, GDP is going to skyrocket when Lytton starts to rebuild. The construction in the roads that have been washed out, GDP went up. There were lots of people working, but it doesn't measure the social and the economic and the environmental devastation that happened. It's just GDP went up, and we consider that a good. So genuine progress indicators, if we start truly looking at those, measuring well-being And then we can say, you know, we're not doing good enough. We can start addressing well-being. Another big field for the university here is around forestry and natural resources. Are you learning about restoration, fully functioning intact ecosystems and the services they provide, and how to protect them as the basis of the study? Let's follow an example through. So if you want to look at fish population health, it requires cool, clean water all year long. So we need to prevent erosion, restore riparian zones that shade streams, allow water to filter through wetlands, maintain forest cover that slows snowmelt, preserve soils that hold water and release it slowly into the environment. In short, we need education that first identifies what needs to be protected before we start talking about what can we remove from that system. So if you're graduating with these ideas as your foundation, it gives me a lot of hope. You'll be transforming society and policy, how we use and take care of the planet. And if you're challenging your professors with these ideas, it gives us a lot of hope. And the very fact that you're taking the time to put on this forum, that gives me a lot of hope too. So I brushed the surface, and I'll hand it over to others on the panel and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. Who would like to go next?
I mean, I'm happy to continue if we just want to go
down.
down.
Do that.
Great, excellent, thank you so much. My name is Rylan. I'm an assistant professor in municipal planning and sustainability. Grateful to be here today to talk about what is an important topic, you know, both for me in my scope of research and teaching interest, but more specifically to planning as a discipline. Certainly, sustainability is woven into the plans that we create and adopt. So that's kind of my approach that I'm coming to this from, is the planning discipline as a previously practicing planner. So in fact, some of the things that I was going to talk about there is already greatly articulated, and hopefully I can expand on some of the things that she's already mentioned here. But for me, you know, as a relative newcomer to Prince George, being here for about a year now, I think it's first, or I think what I've done since I've arrived is, you know, taking a moment to reflect on what I see as Prince George and the types of growth and development that have materialized over the years. So I think it's first important to reflect on the decades of growth and development that have occurred in Prince George, and whether that has been a sustainable model of growth, or there's opportunity to build a more sustainable community. So again, having been here for only about a year or so, you know, some of the things that stand out to me about Prince George is that it is a, you know, relatively small population over an expansive geographical region, in particular, and more specifically, over an expansive urban footprint. And so part of what, you know, I've seen as I've driven around, as I've walked around, you know, a lot of the growth has materialized along Highway 97. And so we've really stretched out, you know, the city far to the north and far to the south. And this corridor has kind of been this linear growth that's extended and expanded, you know, our urban footprint. And so, you know, some of people, as I moved here, I haven't had too many visitors yet, but as friends and family have asked me, you know, what is Prince George like as a city, or what are the characteristics? Most of these are planner friends who have an interest in these sorts of things. You know, some of the things that stand out to me is that it is, you know, a relatively low density city, dispersed population, and very auto-oriented. And so, you know, I'm not passing judgment over, you know, previous decisions that we've made. In fact, some of these characteristics are pretty typical of Canadian cities. We see this in cities across the country. And so for me, you know, one of my major research interests is smaller and mid-sized cities like Prince George, and how they shift sort of their model of growth and development towards something that is more sustainable. I think that there are significant barriers in places like Prince George, which impede shifting towards more sustainable growth. And I would argue that, you know, these forms of growth, these characteristics that define Prince George, are problematic. I mean, the idea that we're a dispersed city and an auto-dependent city and a low-density city, you know, those are some of the core characteristics of urban sprawl. And we know that sprawl is an unsustainable form of growth, environmentally, economically, socially, you know, and so for the purposes of today's discussion, maybe just focusing on the environmental component of sprawl. And so, you know, part of what I see is that Prince George, during periods of even no growth or stagnant growth continues to grow upwards. And so that's problematic because we continue to lose these sort of natural or important ecological areas to uses, and further exasperating the auto dependency of the city, right? The further we grow out, the more we're locking people in to relying on their car to navigate our city. And obviously, we know that the transportation sector has a significant or plays a significant role in GHG emissions. And so by continuing to double down on that, we're further exasperating the problem. So, I see that development is not inherently bad. There are different types of development which can be more sustainable than others. So, I think the path forward to building more sustainable communities is about both a where and a what question. And the where is, where are we growing? Where are we directing new population? There was a report that went to the city last week, I believe it was, that noted that the city would require over 10,000 new housing. Then there's the complementary commercial, industrial, institutional uses with that. So where is that growth going to occur? Are we going to continue to grow out, further locking in car dependency, or can we redirect that growth towards, the existing urban footprint, towards our neighborhoods, which, again, one of my observations is that there's plenty of low-hanging fruit, and low-hanging fruit in this context is redevelopment opportunities. Our downtown has a plethora of surface parking lots. I live in the Crescents neighborhood where there is plenty of empty, overgrown lots. Those are opportunities to redirect population growth and development towards these existing growth, so that we don't have to continue. The what question, I think, is, again, characteristic for what we've seen previously is that this is our housing typology is very low density, right? We have I'd say, a heavy reliance on single detached dwellings as our housing form in the city. There's an opportunity, I think, moving forward to shift towards higher density. And I'm not talking about 30, 40-story towers that we see in Yaletown, higher density in the context of apartments or townhouses or laneway suites or any of those sort of medium density typologies. The same could be said for our commercial areas as well. And so I think part of the shift in terms of types of development is also shifting towards more mixed use development, right? How do we make our city more compact? We've, the last 70 years, planners and their allies and governments and others, developers have really, separated commercial over here, residential over here. And I think that the thinking in terms of sustainability is how do we bring these things together? So it is both a land use question. I think it's also a mobility question as well. Again, the auto dependency and the auto orientation of our community. How do we begin to shift the reliance on the car? Something like 90% of people in Prince George commute by car, meaning that 10% collectively commute by transit, walk, cycle, other comparable means. That's significant. 90% is, even compared to other mid-sized cities, that's very high. So how do we start to shift that? I think Canadian cities have typically directed the majority of their transportation budget towards auto-based infrastructure. We need to start carving out more of the dollars towards transit or infrastructure for walking or cycling. I mean, again, I live in the Crescents neighborhood, central neighborhood. My neighborhood barely has sidewalks. Well, automatically you're sending the cues that this is not a neighborhood. And they don't walk. And I was a person who, in my previous city, didn't drive, didn't own a car. As soon as I moved to Prince George, basically walked into buying a car, having to commute, the automobile. So part of the mobility question is both land use, bringing things closer together, but also where we're directing our attention, right? And we need to start carving out more money for these more sustainable modes of transportation. The role of the university, I think, is an interesting question. I see the university as potentially both being an influencer and also as a developer. So in the influencer capacity, I mean, this institution is, I'd say, a big fish in a small pond here in Prince George, and I think has significant political clout to try to influence, allies or other stakeholders in the city to start to, bring together some of those things I talked about. How does the university use its influence to, make better connections with the city, physical connections, so that people can walk up the hill to the university or bike up the hill? Right now, we've provided pretty bare minimal infrastructure, and so we get pretty minimal number of people actually biking. We built a commuter campus here, and it's time to reimagine how we might, create a campus that's better connected. The university as a developer, I think, is interesting. I mean, universities are city builders. They own significant physical assets. They reshape neighborhoods. And so I think the question moving forward is the university as a developer through this new land trust, where they're exploring the opportunity to develop a neighborhood adjacent to the university, I think is an interesting practice. It's something we're seeing in universities across primarily Western Canada with major land holdings developing a new neighborhood. So, in developing that new neighborhood, I think is imperative that it be sustainable and it mirrors some of those characteristics that I've already mentioned. Mixed use, compact, higher density, transit oriented, walkable. I think it would be a missed opportunity if we see sort of a continuation of the type of development we've seen elsewhere in Prince George, Uptiner Boulevard, which is low density, single use, auto oriented. I think the university has a role to play in establishing a higher standard for development, and certainly other universities again have done the same. I think there's lots to be learned from SFU, both as the influencer and the developer. SFU built sort of the first university neighborhood, and it's was regarded as being meeting best practices, highly sustainable. Doing something similar in the context of storage would be fitting. And I also think similarly to using political quote, Simon Fraser has successfully worked with allies to build rebonding from the bottom of the hill up to the campus. So I'm not certainly suggesting that that's what we do, but it seems like there are opportunities to better connect our university to the city. So again, I think it is about examining where we are. If we want to build more sustainably, what are the things we need to do? I think it is about where we direct growth, what development looks like, how we get around, and I think the university is a significant.
It's really nice. Tannis, would you like to add?
Thank you both. That was really interesting. I like the idea of more trails, biking trails, and also maybe doing things smarter and maybe having service areas in the same location. Different things like that are really interesting. It's important to always have focus groups and always be involved in what's happening in your local area. So my name is Tannis Reynolds, and I'm from the Stalactite First Nation. I belong to the Caribou or Lexili clan, and my traditional name is Lee clan. And I'm a lecturer in the First Nation Studies Department here at UNBC. So of course, we're on the traditional territory of the Lheidli Dene. And the Lheidli Dene note that their elders, teachers, drummers, and other artists pass on their traditions and teachings to the next generation, keeping their culture alive and strong. So it's always important for everyone to remember to work with the local Indigenous people and work with the people on whose traditional territory you're on. As well, work with the local Indigenous organizations in the area. Prince George has several Indigenous organizations, so many Indigenous people in the local area who would love to be involved in planning and work that you're doing. So in 2017, the Assembly of First Nations called for a joint committee on climate action following the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 32. And they focused on the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. In Canada, BC, and the city of Prince George, we must consult and cooperate in good faith with local Indigenous people. It's been important work by Indigenous people all across Canada to be involved in planning, to be involved before the planning and the work is done, so it's important for people to be involved early on. And it's important to be involved in a way that is cooperative. So it is important to mitigate adverse environmental, economic, social, cultural, and spiritual impacts to the local Indigenous people in the work that is being done. And to ensure full and effective participation of local elders and knowledge holders. So it's important to contact local people like the First Nation, the Métis elders, the Qureshi organizations in the area. There are many Indigenous organizations work here, and the youth in the area. So I started a project on a project, I should say. I didn't start the project, but I was asked to be a part of it with the First Nations Leadership Council in Canada. And I was appointed to the First Nations Climate Action Technical Advisory Group in March 2021. And we've been through a few drafts of the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan. And being on the group, we mainly offer guidance and direction and technical support when needed. And there's several people on the meetings that I went to. There's at least 10 or more of us in the group working on this document, and they did focus groups with Indigenous youth and Indigenous leaders from Canada and BC and the local areas. From the First Nations Leadership Council, the Assembly of First Nations representative, Terry Teach-In, was highly involved in that work. So a lot of the work is considering states of emergency, food security, self-determination, culture, and stewardship. And so I would really encourage people to keep an eye out for the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan that will be out in the near future, because we all need clean water to survive. We should not be polluting our lakes, rivers, and oceans. Therefore, we must change the way everything works to ensure clean water for everything and everyone. We must learn to manage ourselves to create sustainable environments for future generations to come, instilling our value systems that promote respect for Mother Earth. And this is one simple way to be consistent and positive as we move forward. So, Masicho.
All right, now over to Ramla. Thank you. Hi folks, my name is Ramla Qureshi. I'm an assistant professor here at School of Engineering in UNBC. By profession, I'm a structural and earthquake engineer, so I guess I can bring in the one aspect of all of this conversation that has probably, because everyone has covered this absolutely brilliantly. And I bring the worst aspect of the problem, which is construction. So globally, construction amounts to over, I guess, 30% of carbon dioxide emissions. And it is just something that we cannot really stop doing all of a sudden, right? In 7 years, I can guarantee you that we're not going to stop constructing, especially not going to stop using concrete. Having said that, let me quickly give you a little bit of introduction of what I do as a structural engineer. I work with the built environment and analyze its resilience towards natural and man-made hazards. Those hazards can be earthquakes, fires, floods, high winds, like tornadoes, etc. We don't really have those here that much, but let's say south of the border. Or man-made. For example, the explosion that we all were witness to in Beirut, Lebanon, in 2020, right? So those things are also a huge impediment towards sustainability. So one word that I was looking for but has been not mentioned yet is resilience. A lot of times people are very angry at concrete construction, but as an engineer, especially as a civil structural engineer, I like to bring this point to the discussion that, well, if I am designing a concrete structure and it lasts 100 years, that right there is a very sustainable building, right? Because it did what it was made for over 100 years. Especially here in BC, we see this push for mass timber structures, which is absolutely amazing. It's low weight construction, right? It's very sustainable, very green. But how resilient is it? What happens if there is a fire? Do we actually know? While a lot of engineers say, well, we understand fire performance of timber, it's all good. But there's so many questions that are still present in this conversation right now that limits construction of structures that are mass timber, let's say, pretty much. Like, stakeholders don't want to spend a lot of money in a building that they're not confident about. So while policymakers can come and say, yeah, we have to stop construction of concrete, is it really very practical? That's the question that I need to ask as an engineer, right? Having said that, these days I'm teaching an engineering materials course where I make it a point in every civil engineering material, be it aluminum, be it steel, concrete, aggregate, asphalt, anything that you're using, how can we make the material sustainable, right? So if there is probably a good chance that we're not going to stop using concrete. That means there's probably a good chance we're not going to stop producing cement. So how can we make the process more sustainable? How can we reduce energy demands in that process? The building demand keeps increasing, especially here in BC right now. There is a lot of push for construction, and there's a lot of construction happening that isn't necessarily inspected, regulated. For example, there is history of wildfire or wildland urban interaction fires in BC, especially in Okanagan regions. And yet we see a lot of new construction happening in the regions that are prone to fire. So is anybody doing land use risk assessments for such a thing? Is anybody actually incorporating all of this knowledge into the building code? Are we protecting our current structures, especially exactly like you mentioned, the existing built environment? Is it retrofitted? Is it still usable? Is there a way I can increase its lifespan? Let's say a building was made to last for 75 years. Can I do some touch-ups, some TLC to help, increase it to, let's say, last 100 years, right? So these are a lot of things that we as engineers are faced with, because an architect can say, yeah, we need a building that has lower energy consumption, but it still needs to look like this, whimsical sculpture of art. And trust me, that happens a lot. And at that point, you have to say, well, yeah, but only if you only can use, maybe steel would help, right? And steel, again, steel construction, steel production is a very energy consuming process in itself. So then there has to be this interdisciplinary work, I guess is the word I'm looking for, between those who are designing the built environment and those who are making sure it stays standing, which is people like myself. So that's the other side of this conversation, is that resilience needs to also be a contributing factor towards looking into the built environment in general. So I can guarantee you that if there's a building that is resilient, 100% that building is sustainable, because it's going to last against earthquakes, it's going to last against fires, it's going to last, or let's say, well, you can't necessarily really design a building to last any kind of hazard. That's just not possible because hazards are unquantifiable, but you can give a good confidence, right? Based on statistical knowledge. So that is one thing that I wanted to bring into this conversation, especially in the context of Prince George. There's a lot of new construction that's happening, and that has been a bit of concern for me as well. People making these, residential land use for an area that they don't necessarily need. How resilient is that here, right? Not just sustainable, but how resilient is this? Is it helping them against hazards? Is it helping them? So think of maybe one thing that can help direct this conversation a bit is if I say to you that COVID was an architectural problem, would you agree with me? Right? In areas like China, for example, where there is high density living, the pandemic actually brought forth the fact that people couldn't really isolate, right? So they were actually transmitting this infection. So there is so much to think of when we are looking into this. Now, what can UNBC do that? And what we are actually doing is that in engineering, especially, the books that we were taught were written at the turn of the century when construction was all hype, progress, the Industrial Revolution. Everybody was looking into strength and steel were equated, right? We even have phrases like man of steel, nerves of steel. These are things that were made part of our vernacular because we were equating all of this construction towards progress. The tables have turned. Now we have to teach our engineers to look into conservation, to reduction, to rehabilitation, retrofit, all of those things. And that is where the university, especially younger universities like UNBC that are not that institutionalized. So for example, I gave a lecture at another university in BC, very ultra established university. And there were a lot of questions, well, how do we change this now, right? So here in UNBC, we have the freedom to carve a new path. We have the freedom to be asking questions around this that, things that we were probably taught are not necessarily going to be what the prospective engineer is going to face. So the hazards have changed. The use case has changed. The risk has changed. The stakeholders have changed as well. Right? So there's a lot of things that UNBC, and I completely agree with UNBC having political clout in this. We have leaders who are vocal around this. That there's so much to construction that can be changed, whereas there's so much to the marketing around construction that can also be changed, right? So while we admit that we are probably not going to stop using concrete and steel for a while, maybe we can look into the existing infrastructure that we have and how we can make it more robust. What if we make our roadways that amazing that we don't have to reconstruct them every year, right? So that would phenomenally change how sustainable this city could be. So there's all of these conversations where engineers and people who are actually engineering solutions can come to the table and bring in these newer use cases, which are not necessarily that radical that they say, well, yes, stop using all concrete from now on. That's just not going to happen. So these are, I can talk a lot around this because that is all my research that I do. I work with fires, I work with earthquakes, I work with rehab of structures. And I completely understand why there is a push for using timber structures in BC. And I also exercise caution when pushing for such a thing because we still have a long way to go in research. So while we are researching that, why not actually make full use of construction methodology?
And if I may, I was thinking in terms of engaging early, and also, so you were talking about innovation, interdisciplinary, but also bringing in kind of that Indigenous guidance and see, because they have been building for how long within this context, right? Can you imagine kind of the cool stuff that we could come up with as a young university, bringing in they're talking about the densification and actually bringing the economics of how this stuff costs. I think it also aid in your, right? If we actually incorporate the true costs of everything that we do, we would be doing things right. Absolutely. So bringing all you forward, really, it's just bringing all you forward together. And leading on, but I hear you in terms of being a young university. That is a power, right? Because we haven't entrenched ourselves. Not yet, anyway. It's getting there. Right? Get a little longer in the tooth. Any questions right off? Because I got one. Okay, me first. Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's go back to the question. So the question was, so how can Prince George and the university support the building of sustainable communities? So I was thinking, all four of you and the perspectives that you brought. If you could have, let's just say there was all the resources that you could have, there was no limitations, no impediments. If you could have one thing to contribute to sustainability, just be the university, but if it was just one thing, one priority, when it comes to sustainable Prince George region, no holds barred. I'll start over from there. You can say passive. You're not ready now?
Circular economy.
Oh, I do like that one. Do you want to just expand a smidge on that? Because not everybody's
Yeah, so
familiar
the
with the term.
idea of the circular economy is, you know, products and goods, endless reuse of their value. So, you know, if there's, at some local governments, they have done a complete picture of every input that comes into their town, like from clothing to food to plastic products, and they figured out, you know, what actually comes from elsewhere, and then looking at, you know, can you supply any of that in some form locally, so you don't have to bring it? Is there a way to use that material again and again and again locally, so that you don't ever have to bring it in new again? And so that idea of just continually, the materials that we have, make sure that we can use them so that we're not constantly, you know, tapping into the natural world to bring more and more stuff that's distributed and lost in a system.
And I would think of doing so that, and I know so, it would increase our resiliency, because then we're not so reliant upon the movement. I always see it as a wheel, and very little is getting spit out. Whereas right now, we are spewing stuff all over the place, and stuff is coming in, it's getting spewed all over the place. Whereas if it's a circular economy, very little gets spit out, because it's just being recirculated. All right, over. Would you like to talk?
Sure. If I had one, no holds barred. Okay, interesting. You know, sticking to the theme of growth and development, I would advocate for a hard target on intensification, where the city annually requires a certain amount of growth and development to happen or occur within its existing built area, right? Rather than trying to sort of using loose language to try to want to encourage these sorts of things, how do we actually make it happen? So some sort of target, as many cities do, where they require, you know, an annual percentage of growth and development. In some cities, it's as high as 50% of growth development occurs within the existing built area. You know, that is how we begin to build more sustainable, economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable communities. So some sort of intensification target would be my, if I was king of Prince George for a day.
Great, if you could just rule
Sure.
for a day, this is what's going to happen. Okay, with that cap on.
If you can figure out how to get rid of the potholes. I know that sitting with many different Indigenous groups in BC, that the representatives' main concern is the sustainability of the environment, and if we do depend on natural resources here in BC, then why can't we manage those natural resources sustainably? And if we were looking after our forests, if we were looking after our waters, we would be in a better position. And so my wish is always that the future generations, like for myself and my community, that the future generations will be able to do traditional activities like hunt and fish and gather as we always have. And so that is really an important part of the discussion for Indigenous people. And many of the Indigenous people who I've worked with on this group all were very serious about climate change and very serious about making drastic change now, like laying down the law so that change really happens, because it is a huge concern and Indigenous people take it very seriously.
So baking it right in, making it so that we can, by calculation, by quantitative and qualitative outcomes, say, we know for a fact for the next generations to come, we are able to maintain the cultural tradition. Absolutely. I think that's completely reasonable. Let's make it so. All right. Now, what you
Just if I could, I would probably have better policy making. Our policies, and this is going to come it came as a surprise to me when I graduated and actually stepped into the field of engineering, how much engineering is actually influenced by lobbies. Right, so this, for example, in the USA, where I did my PhD, the steel lobby, the steel industry is very powerful, right? So they pour massive amounts of money towards PhDs and research funds and all of that to actually say, well, yeah, we can gain XYZ results. So if I had something similar, I would probably pour a similar amount of money into other construction materials, let's say, that would help. Because research, as we saw in the case again of the pandemic, research is dependent on the funding. We were able to get let's say, revolutionary vaccines in the field less than a year because the world poured money into it. So if I had no borders for it, I would probably put in a lot of money and fast track that research so that we understand better, because we, like Lara mentioned, we're running out of time and we need answers really fast. However, the lobbies do affect a lot of decisions when you step into the actual field. That's where things start to go up.
And I would think across the board as well, because the war room in Alberta was just found to, so I was going to take a step further. If you had no holds barred ability, neutering the policy process and disallowing lobbying, because, yeah, sure. Because the war, yes, go ahead. I was like, could we just take it one step further?
Yeah.
It's not all.
No, I wanted to jump in on that. It's a really interesting topic. If you think about in BC, what that means in BC, but the forest industry. And if you look at the forest industry and you talk about mass timber, well, what is mass timber? Mass timber is moving apart smaller and smaller pieces of wood to get something big enough to use, like with the kind of strength that has. But if you actually go back to really old, slow-grown, healthy wood, and if you had that on the landscape and could harvest bits of that, you've got a quality product that you don't need to go further and further down the value chain to use smaller and smaller pieces of wood to make mass timber. You know, like
Yeah. I think that's a ponder.
That's a very good point. But see, then again, do we have access to sustainably grown or aged? No. So there's exactly
Catch-22?
Exactly. That's where engineering innovation.
Great. Well, that was good. My gosh, just like a lot. I couldn't imagine that. It's like the mind drop. Any questions or comments? To me, that's kind of the problem. You know what? Thank you so much, Pam. This has just been awesome. What's lovely is that it's recorded. So again, the echo goes out there, right? And thank you again, organizers. This has just been awesome. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Hannah,